Great, thank you so much. And thanks to William and Ben for running the Data Minutes event today. In this session, we are going to spend 10 minutes talking about the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. And this is a short introduction to the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. I'm going to briefly explain what it is. Then I'm going to spend most of the time that we have here with a couple of key concepts and a few suggestions for how you might go about using this roadmap. Think of this roadmap as a series of strategic and tactical considerations that can help lead to successful Power BI adoption. And I'm going to elaborate in just a few moments on exactly what I mean by adoption, because it might be a little bit different than what you are thinking. Before I dive into that, just to give kind of credit to the other people that are involved as well, I served as the primary author. I primarily worked with Matthew Roche. He, if you're not familiar, is on the customer advisory team at Microsoft. And as you can imagine, if you know him, he was invaluable in terms of reviewing the content and providing feedback. And Peter Myers was very helpful in terms of doing all the final edits, getting it approved, getting it published over on the Docs platform. Now, our goals with this were really first to help customers get a sense for, well, what are the most important things we should be thinking of when we're planning for a big Power BI implementation? And the roadmap really covers a lot of the people and data culture type of aspects that are much harder than the technology itself. And we provide a high-level guide on priorities and progression, and I'm going to touch on that here in a moment. And since it is a high-level thing, it includes lots of links elsewhere. We wrote it with a certain type of reader in mind, that you have Power BI deployed and you've got some success with it, you've got some good practices, but you might not have purposeful governance in place. And so therefore improving your adoption and your maturity of how Power BI is rolled out is a goal. And that last point's actually an important one because a lot of organizations find themselves in situation one here across the top where Power BI has been rolled out, and then at some point in the future, governance needs to be put in after the fact. And so that's actually, of the three scenarios shown here, is a little bit tougher because you're asking people to change what they've been doing. So there are 10 main areas in the roadmap, and the sequencing is absolutely not a perfect thing. Every organization has its own starting point, but here's how it works. We start with, first and foremost, what's your data culture? Because understanding what that really is paramount to everything else that's going to happen. And the second thing we talk about is executive support, making sure that you have that support in place for anything that you need to do. 3 and 4 are wildly important and things I talk about a lot with regard to how your content is owned, managed, and delivered. And once you have a deep understanding of all of those things, then you can start with a center of excellence. And personally, I don't care if you have a formal center of excellence on your org chart. What I care about is that somebody is doing the things that are important in that area. And a big emphasis of that is all of these areas about supporting your internal user community. Now, over here on the bottom right, we have governance and we have system oversight. Those things are not last, but governance is placed where it is because you have to understand all these other things before you know what kind of decisions you're going to make. And governance feeds how you actually do system oversight or administration. This whole roadmap has a primary emphasis on what we would call organizational adoption. And when I say adoption, I am not just talking about usage of the system. So let me explain further. We have discussed 3 interrelated types of adoption, or 3 perspectives when it comes to adopting a technology like Power BI. So the first one, user adoption, this is the term you hear most often, and it's the one that's usually used kind of generically with regard to adoption. So we define user adoption as you're increasing your user knowledge that translates into using Power BI effectively and the way we want it to be used. So more usage alone is not enough, if you catch my drift. Solution adoption, here we're talking about not just using the reports and the apps that get created, but that they have impact and that they have business value. And then there's organizational adoption, and that's more about the BI governance and data management practices that support and enable all of our BI efforts. And the roadmap really focuses mostly on that third piece, organizational adoption, but as you can imagine, all three are absolutely highly interrelated and impact each other. The other big thing that we did in the roadmap is we introduced this idea of maturity levels. And these are the same levels that the PowerCat adoption maturity model uses, Microsoft 365 maturity model uses. And the whole idea is to get you thinking about where are you at now and where do you want to be. So briefly, if we just talk about these levels, starting from the bottom, working our way up, level 100 is our starting point. Things are either brand new or informally handled, and good things can absolutely be happening. They're just probably reliant on good judgment by individual people, and they're probably inconsistent and probably undocumented. At level 200, we're starting to standardize, improve, and document things. It's just probably not happening uniformly across the entire organization yet. So level 300 is really important because that's where we really start to get that consistency more so across the organization with guidelines and policies, right? And when I say governance, I mean we're helping users get things done within the guardrails that need to be established. And things like roles and responsibilities are understood. At level 400, we're starting to do things like helping incorporate learnings and existing practices throughout the org. And we're really clear where Power BI fits into the overall BI strategy. Things are much more purposeful. And at the top level, we've gotten really good at making sure that all of our Power BI governance policies align with business objectives. We have specific and measurable governance goals and KPIs, and we're tracking them for iterative continual progress, and automation is usually a priority here to help with all of that continuous improvement. So here's where it gets really tricky. We're going to have different maturity levels depending on the lens that we take. So let's say we do an assessment and we say, overall, our organization feels like we're at a level 300. But meanwhile, you might have different business units or large departments that are at different levels. And that should intuitively make sense because you're going to have different groups that are more mature than others in how they handle data. You've also got individual capabilities. You can almost think about it as the articles on the roadmap that are going to have different maturity levels. And so as you start to look at them, think about it from these different lenses because it is much more complicated than just saying the entire org as a whole is at a certain level. And so these variances in maturity levels can be either A, very purposeful, based on where you devote your resources, or accidental, because it's just something you've never paid attention to before. So to wrap up, how I suggest that you get started using this roadmap is first to just review it end to end, get familiar with the concepts and the considerations, and then figure out your current state for each area. And I mean the good, the bad, and the ugly. And also figure out what future state, where do you really want to be for each of those 10 areas, and for these individual business units if you need to account for them differently. And then start to customize those maturity levels for each area. As we wrote them, they're very generic. They're not going to line up exactly for you. And so you need to figure out what does success look like for you, and then prioritize and track. And so the biggest message there is that you don't have to be at a level 500 for absolutely everything. What you need to do is define which pieces are more important and where do you devote your resources for each one of the different areas. And that concludes our whirlwind tour of the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. So I hope you find the content helpful and enjoy the rest of the Data Minutes event.